from middleschoollanguageartsteachers.com. Today's training is all about alternative assessments. Some people refer to them as alternative or authentic assessments, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on realistic ideas for implementation and grading. Let's dive in. When we're talking about alternatives to assessments, we're pretty much referring to projects in class, but it could also be daily work, daily tasks, just different ways of assessing our students to check their mastery, to check their understanding, their comprehension of the material. So we're looking for ways to be creative, ways to provide differentiated instruction. That's really the foundation on which alternatives to authentic and other types of assessments are based. We're just looking for something different other than standard multiple choice questions and answer choices, or assignments that only require one correct answer. That's really what we're looking at here. So we're going to talk about tests and projects, but we're also going to dive into what alternative assessments can look like just from day-to-day school. This is another ongoing realistic support on-demand training that I'm uploading into the Language Arts Teachers members only area. So about every 4 to 6 weeks I upload a new one. So I'm excited to share this one with you guys today. By the time you finish, my goal for you is that you will have clarity and that you will feel relief and actually have a plan for how you might want to use alternative assessments in your own classroom. Plus, stay tuned because upon the completion of this particular training, I will provide a professional development certificate, good for 1 hour of continuing education credit. It's up to your school or maybe your campus administration as to how that counts for you. But I think it's just one more tool that you can put into your professional development tool bag, showing that you are continuing to stay up on current educational trends. So what you're going to learn today, essentially, we're going to focus on 3 main topics. We're going to look at specific ideas for alternative assessments. We're going to talk about how to hold students accountable during such projects. And we're going to talk about steps to easy grading of these alternative assessments. All right, let's take a step back. Let's be a little bit reflective. Can I put you on the spot for a second? What do you feel when someone says to use more alternative assessments? What do you feel? What is that first gut response? So think about it this way. Are you comfortable with using alternative forms of assessment in your classroom? Is that something that you feel good about doing? Do you enjoy that? And if not, what's keeping you from feeling good about it? In fact, how much of your own personal time are you spending trying to create alternative forms of assessments for your students? How much pressure do you feel to have to do this? I want you to know that you're in the right place. If you're currently teaching middle school English language arts and you're just looking to try out some new ways of assessing your students without drowning in planning or grading them, this is exactly the training for you. I know that you want to feel relaxed and confident and peaceful about using various types of assessments without any of that overwhelm that comes from trying to do something different all the time for all your different units. That can build up, and I know there's a lot of pressure around trying to figure out the best way to assess your students in ways that are creative and authentic. You might even be feeling uncertain about why you even need to mess with creating or using alternative forms of assessment. So that's something that we'll talk about today as well. Now, let's be realistic. We're going to talk about some of those challenges. So 3 real challenges with alternative assessments. These are the top 3. There are more than 3, of course. These are the top 3 that I personally have encountered and coached teachers through around this topic. And it's one of the foundations of this training that I put together. I realize this is something that many teachers struggle with year to year. And so let's look at the top 3 challenges. First of all, finding time to plan it all. When on earth do you plan these out, organize them, and gather the materials? The second issue is, how do you actually ensure that students are accountable each day? So when you're thinking about a project or something that's ongoing, a more long-term assessment process, how do you make sure that students are actually working every day? How do you know what they're really doing? And how do you hold them accountable? And finally, one issue is I just can't grade it all. Teachers tend to have a preconceived notion that alternative assessment automatically means something that's going to be difficult to grade. So what we're going to do today is talk about easy, realistic ways to grade it. In fact, ways that are easier than your standard multiple choice test, which is what most people feel comfortable with grading. And I totally get it. I mean, you cannot spend an exorbitant amount of time grading this stuff. So we're going to talk about grading it all. Okay, so what about you? I will talk about my story with alternative assessments, and maybe this is something you can relate to. First of all, in the early years, I thought of alternative assessments as meaning endless trips to the school library. Students trying to find books, or students using the computers, or trying to look up and research different things, and me trying to keep track of all of it, trying to keep all the students on task. That's where the focus comes in, right? We tend to think that students are going to have lots of freedom with all these different projects, and that sounds great in theory, but really, how do we keep them focused? How do we hold them accountable? How do we ensure that they have a worthy product, that we are able to record a grade, and that we don't get to the end of a 1-week period of time and students basically have nothing accomplished, and then we have to answer to their parents about why they have poor grades in class. So those are some of my personal stories with alternative assessments in the early days. All right, let's move on. Don't forget this one too. Listening to monotonous student presentations. It doesn't always have to be a presentation. It doesn't have to be something that even requires, presenting to the entire class or to you. There are other ways to look at it. All right. So me having personally gone through those things, me having thought that that's what alternative assessments meant, countless hours in the library, trying to keep students focused on their tasks, and me listening to endless boring presentations, I thought something's got to change. So after the first couple years of teaching, and I'm nearing the 20-year mark at this point, but I did become pretty fascinated with what might count as an alternative assessment. I wanted to ensure that students were held accountable each day of the project. So I found ways to do that too, and that's something we're going to look at as well today. Plus, there's no way between husband and daughter and family and dogs and all the other obligations outside of work, there's no way I was going to sacrifice my personal time grading all of them. So I found some great strategies, some realistic ways to make sure that these alternative projects did not take over my time. We'll talk about that today as well. All right, so our first topic, let's just dive into time, planning something new. What I figured out is that once you have a format or a template, or look at things you already have is what I'm saying. Keep the same format or template and let students be creative in working within those boundaries. So whether it's a choice board, whether it's a handout of some sort, whether it's a menu, like a literature menu, whatever it is that you have, you can reuse the same format or template over and over and over because they're full of choices. For example, choice boards is one thing that I just mentioned. Look at this one. This is not a huge end of the unit choice board. This is actually taken from the 7th grade, 5th week, 3rd day. I believe it's the narrative reading and writing unit. I don't know, maybe it's descriptive. I can't remember at this point. But anyway, the students have just read the short story Priscilla and the Wimps. And so here we have a choice board. Students would not complete all of these items. This is an example of a doable alternative assessment. It's not a major project. It's simply a way for students to think more creatively and more deeply about something that you've just spent the last day or two on. So instead of giving them a series of multiple choice questions to see how well they understood the story and the concepts of a short story or elements of fiction unit, you could have them complete a certain number of these. Now the instructions say complete any 5 of the 8 items on the choice board, but really it could be anything. You could say, complete 1 item from the first column, 1 item from the second column. You could refer to rows. So if you look horizontally from left to right, you see that there are 4 rows. You could tell students to choose 1 item from each row. It depends on your students. It's a really good way to differentiate for various levels of students who are working. And it also does provide a different way to assess your students' understanding. Plus, looking at questions like this means that your students are going to be able to dive deeper into the story and actually reflect on it and learn through the process of the assessment itself. That's powerful. Okay, so looking at this choice board, you might think, well, but how can I repeatedly use a choice board without creating anything new every time, right? Because isn't this particular choice board specific only to Priscilla and the Wimps? Would I have to create one like this for every single short story? No, of course not. Check this out. Right? On the left, I have a specific choice board for Priscilla and the Wimps. But on the right, I took that same exact choice board and I made it a generic choice board that could fit with any short story. I simply removed the title, Priscilla and the Wimps. I looked through just a few of the questions looking for specifics to that story in particular, and I removed them. You can see where I left blanks in lieu of the characters and the specifics to the story. Now I've got a choice board that I can use for pretty much any short story I teach. So regardless of what grade level you teach, whether it's 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, you now know that you could go to the lesson plans, look in the either the descriptive or the narrative unit for grade 7, week 5, day 3, and you know now that you could take that choice board and make it fit for any of your short story lessons. Okay, here's a close-up of that generic choice board. You can better see how certain words have been replaced by lines, words that would only pertain to that particular story. I'll leave this here for just a second so you can read through the different questions. Okay, hope that makes sense and gives you some ideas for how you can take something you already have full access to and quickly edit it or turn it into something that you can use over and over and over as an alternative assessment. Okay, let's look at another example of an alternative assessment. Take this one. This one's also taken from 7th grade. Personal writing and storytelling. Look at the types of questions. We have questions about the details in the setting, questions that involve students using text evidence. In fact, on the bottom row, we have questions about the flashbacks in the story, in the narrative. This is from a narrative unit, I'm sure of it. And then we have a very specific question there at the end about the relationship between the mother and daughter. Okay, so this is a very specific story, very specific set of questions around I believe it's around a memoir that is in the 7th grade narrative reading and writing unit. How could you modify this particular one to make it fit for any memoir or for any short story, really? Just think to yourself, how can I repeatedly use a choice board I already have without having to create something new every time? And of course, you probably have already figured it out. All I need to do is change around some of the questions and make them more generic so I can use the same storyboard over and over. So here we go. We have the choice board on the left that I just spoke about. And then again, look at what I did on the right. I simply went to a few of those questions that were a little bit specific to that particular story, and I changed out the specifics to make them more generic. So as you can see, choice boards contain so many options for alternative assessments, both large and small. It could be something done at the end of a novel. It could be something done at the end of a short story. One more thing that I wanted to mention. It's okay to go old school. So whether you're using Chromebooks or some other form of one-to-one device, it's okay to pull out the markers, the colored pencils, the pens, and combine assignments into one assignment. It's okay to go old school and to have the students actually create something on paper. Did you want to see this one more time? What we did here is I took vocabulary words that students were expected to know for that particular grade level and combined it with an assessment of prepositions and prepositional phrases. The students had to mark them, they had to put them both into the same assignment, and that's an alternative form of assessment. I specifically remember I tossed the vocabulary quiz, I got rid of the prepositional phrase worksheet that I'd gotten from another source, and created my own assignment. That's something that also counts as an alternative form of assessment. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the second point today. We talked about time and finding creative ways to creatively assess our students. Let's go and talk about how technology can serve as a tool to use for alternative forms of assessment in the classroom. Let me ask you this. What right now is your comfort level with kids using technology for alternative assessments? Everyone's going to feel a little bit different about this. If your classroom is full of one-to-one devices, if they're easy to get for you, if they're easy for you to implement in your classroom, if you have good systems in place, this might be a no-brainer. But if you're in a school that lacks these technology resources, if it's a big deal to have to try to get them, then that might be something else to consider. But regardless, thinking about 21st century skills, thinking about things that our schools have access to, that most of our schools have access to, I wanted to include some ideas for technology in your classroom as a form of alternative assessment. We can present several options to students to use technology to create a product that shows us what they know. So that's what I'm going to dive in here for the next few slides. What are those technology options that we can have our students do or use to create their own projects or to just create their own way of showing us and showing each other what they know about a particular concept or topic? So I came across this quote by John Dewey, and I thought it was so perfect for just this part of the training, of the online training. We don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on the experience. And so when I thought about different types of technology that students can use to create their own alternative form of assessment, it just seemed like the perfect place to put this, because through the process of completing their alternative form of assessment, they're learning even more, and they're learning even deeper. Okay, so the first type of free technology that I wanted to mention is something called screencastomatic. In fact, this very training is me using screencastomatic. Just go to screencastomatic.com. There's a free version, and it's exactly what this is right now. Basically, whatever is on your computer desktop, you click on Screencast-O-Matic. It's a little, it's just a little icon that you can download that connects to the software online, and then you can record anything that's on your desktop. So think about how you could introduce this to your students and how they could create a PowerPoint, a Prezi. They could make something online. It could be something that they type, something that they know all kinds of softwares that I'm sure we're not even thinking of right now. And if they can record themselves giving the presentation kind of the way that I'm doing now, how cool would that be for them to get a chance to explain their learning and to show what they know? So that's one option. Here's another one, Animoto. Most people have heard of this one, but it's pretty simple for students to use too. If you can set it up for them and give them access, they can figure it out from there. It's especially fun and engaging for students to use because it involves videos, music, pictures, words, and students have to be very, very careful about how they put it all together, because Animoto's, at least the free version anyway, is only so long and it only allows for so much text. So if you're thinking about the power of words, how a few words can say so much, Great for alternative assessments about main ideas or themes or things that are not going to be very wordy. Animoto can be a winner. Prezi I mentioned a second ago. Prezi works a lot like a PowerPoint. In fact, if your students have created a PowerPoint, they can upload it into Prezi, very easy, and just the way that it moves, the way that the Prezi presentation works, it's user-friendly, it's a very low learning curve, and kids will like it because it has much more of an interactive quality to it. So that's another way for them to present information. This is a fun one, and it requires a little bit more work. It's called Storyboard That. You can find it at storyboardthat.com. And just as you can see in the image over on the right, it basically allows students to choose characters, a setting. They create a story, it's a storyboard, just what it says. It's digital storytelling. It's free. And so you can use it to review a short story that you've read, a novel. You could even use it to show the characters talking about a new concept that you just taught. So it doesn't have to just be fiction. So many creative ways to use it. Okay, so regardless of what kind of technology you're using, how can we ensure that students are actually held accountable each day? Let's talk about the real fear. The fear is that I say, okay, students, I have these 4 or 5 different types of technology you can use to create a project based around, whatever concept you decide. Maybe it's a novel, maybe it's a series of thematically linked, articles, whatever the concept is. And then you turn them loose and the end of the week comes, it's time to present and they're not finished, or they spent the first 4.5 days playing around with the technology online, didn't get anything done really. So that's what we're going to dive into next in this part of the training, is how do we ensure students are actually held accountable each day for their work? Okay, we've got to provide students with a rubric. First of all, it doesn't all just come down to the rubric, but the rubric is the first part of this that we'll talk about. We've got to teach them how to plan backwards, just as I do with the lesson plans, or that you've done as well with lesson plans. You've got to start with the end in mind. What is the final thing that we want our students to do? Okay, and then we've got to plan backwards to make sure that they can get from the point we're at today to the final point that we want them to be at. So we can teach them how to plan backwards. And yes, I will go into more detail on that in a second. We'll also have to break it down by students so that each student has a specific part independent of anyone else's in the group. Now, this is relevant if you have your students working in small groups as part of your alternative form of assessment. We've got to make sure that each student has a role. If your students are completing an alternative form of assessment on their own, then this, of course, would not apply. But so much of what we do is collaborative in the classroom, so if we're moving into that component for students to create a new form of an assessment, we've got to make sure that each have a role to play. Okay, let's talk about this. This is an example of a rubric. This is actually from the debate project that is inside the lesson plan membership. And so in this sense, we can easily see that there are 3 main parts of this debate project to total 100 points. It looks a little bit complicated, but when you really look through it, it's designed for students to actually be able to look through and check things off that they've already done. Okay, let's talk about backwards planning. How do you teach students to backwards plan? Well, check out this planning chart. This is a group planning and organizational chart. You can probably go ahead and see how easy it would be to modify if you had students working independently on their own form of assessment. But look at how Friday's, not Friday's assignments, but Friday's goals are already typed in, right? By Friday, let's say, for example, we will be ready to participate in the debate today. There's no time for finishing touches. Our technology part is done. We know exactly who is talking when and who is running the technology part. We are 100% totally ready. So that's the end goal. One of my biggest pet peeves when I was in the classroom was, okay, Friday is the day for the presentation. And we'd have students come in and they'd say, I just need a few minutes to finish up. And a few minutes, of course, turned into 20 minutes. Pretty soon half the class was over and it was a mess. I learned quickly that I needed to spell out exactly what I wanted the presentation day to look like. That's the end goal. And then from there, we plan backwards. We also need to be sure that, especially with group projects, that we have independent parts for each student. So look at the final column in this not a rubric, but look at the final column in this chart. Which group members will do what today? Be specific. And it's spelled out Monday through Thursday. In fact, it even goes down into Friday. So who's in your group? Which part of the project will each person do? So let's say they're making a PowerPoint and they're going to turn it into a Prezi. So you have to think, okay, well, which students are going to do which slides of the PowerPoint? Well, I don't know which ones are going to do which slides until they figure out what their topic is and what their subtopics are. Maybe there are 3 students in a group and there are 3 subtopics, and perhaps they're going to divide it up like that. So you can see how using a chart like this for group planning and organization will help students take ownership and take control and have accountability over their individual parts. If you have one student who's absent, or if you have a student who just isn't doing what he or she is supposed to do, the project can still go on, because for the example with a PowerPoint presentation, if that's what students are doing, what happens is that section of the presentation would be blank or would be missing or would be incomplete. But it wouldn't affect the other students' grades, because as the teacher, you could watch the presentation one time as the students are presenting, and you could assign a grade to all 3 students. And they wouldn't have to be all the same grade either. Okay, one of my favorite alternative forms of assessment is the Avid OnePager. So I have worked in schools before that were what they called Avid schools. If you're not familiar with Avid, it stands for Advanced, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank now, it's not advanced, it's Advancement via Individual Determination. It's basically a program. And not that I'm a huge proponent of programs per se. I did enjoy learning about and assigning the Avid OnePager, and my students produced some pretty amazing results. Here's an example. This is an example of something that one of my students created to show what they knew about a particular concept. In this sense, it was the concept of figurative language. And so the instructions for creating an Avid OnePager are actually pretty simple. I don't go into the specifics here because with a quick Google search, you can find all kinds of Avid OnePager rubrics and sets of instructions online. It's not hard, but you can tell that they had to use one sheet of paper, only one side of one sheet of paper. They had to fill it with a certain number of examples of figurative language. They had to give examples of figurative language, make up their own, provide images, write descriptions, and essentially fill the page with information. But that is an example of an alternative form of assessment. Here's another one. In this case, this was also an Avid OnePager, but they had to compare the themes or characters in 2 or more reading selections. So this student chose, and this seems so random, I know, but he chose it. He chose the fable The Ant and the Grasshopper. He chose the book, Letters from Rivka. That was a book that this particular class had read earlier in the year. And then they had just finished a informational text piece or text set piece about Harry Houdini. And somehow this student was able to find a connection between The Ant and the Grasshopper, Letters from Rivka, and the article about Harry Houdini. So it seems pretty ridiculous, but look at the amount of writing, and then the images, and then the way the student was able to make connections between 3 seemingly totally unrelated reading selections. So that was pretty funny. But you can see the order, the higher order of thinking. You can see the different ways that this type of assessment could be used. This is the Avid OnePager, and I used to use these all the time in the classroom as an alternative form of assessment. Love these things. So remember, for information about the Avid OnePager, simply Google Avid OnePager and you will find so many easy to use rubrics, lots of ideas for how you can use them in the classroom. Okay, Last thing I wanted to talk about was the issue that you just can't grade it all. It's too much to grade. What do you mean I have to sit down with 35 Avid OnePagers and grade them? I can't do it. But really, that's not what it's about. We've got some easy strategies for you here today. Okay. Involving alternative assessments, we're going to talk about grading, how to make it fast, easy, and use it as an authentic form of feedback. All right, so let's think about these. When would I even grade all this? Okay, I don't know why this particular slide just popped up again. My mistake. That's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be done. So thinking about the Avid OnePagers, when and how would I grade all this? First of all, honestly, with something like this, grade them a little bit at a time each day through maybe using student conferences in class. So when your students are finally at that point of class where they're working independently, call a student up, one or two at a time, have them talk to you about their projects. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It's not a big confidentiality issue. Just give them a chance to talk about what they've created. This could go for the Avid OnePager. It could go for an essay. It could be based on, another form of presentation, maybe one of their technology pieces, which of course you could grade that as they're going through it. But just spend a few minutes talking with your students about their projects. And as they're talking about it, and as you're getting a sense of what they've created, why they created it, and what they're understanding about it, use that as a way to just go ahead and record some grades. If you only get a few done each class each day, you really could probably finish it up in a week. And that means you're not even taking anything home to grade. Plus, look at how authentic your feedback would be if you gave the feedback in real time in your classroom. Okay, if you have an assignment that requires a rubric, for example, the Avid OnePager has a rubric, you could glance over the rubric that the owner and maybe one or two other students have already checked. So perhaps your instructions include that before students turn in their assignment, maybe they have one or two other students look at the rubric, look at the assignment for them, and make suggestions on how they can get the best grade. If you've had the student who completed the assignment along with one or two others look at the rubric together and look for areas of improvement and then turn it in fact, if you go ahead and have the student who created the assignment, go ahead and have him or her actually assign a grade to their own paper. If you can get into the habit of doing it that way, a lot of times you'll find that students grade themselves pretty darn accurately. In fact, sometimes they're a little bit harsher than you would. But that helps you. That gives you a foundation to go ahead and look through, so you're not just grading it from scratch. Finally, another option is to have parents initial the rubric once the student has finished it, but before it's turned in. So whatever the assignment is, the student can, whether they've completed it in class, whether it's something they've worked on at home only, maybe it's a combination of the two, but give the students the rubric, let them take it home, look over the assignment with their parents, the parents can sign it, and then they can turn it into you too. That saves you time because most situations will allow the students to make corrections and improvements before they even turn it into you. And the fewer corrections, the fewer missing pieces, the easier it is for you to grade. Now that depends on, your students and their parents and what kind of school you're in. I know there's so many variables, but that is one thing that you can do. Think about this assignment that we looked at earlier. How simple would it be to grade this alternative assignment? Look at how the students have underlined the parts that I really wanted to grade them on. It's so easy to look at. I can pretty much skim through it and tell how they were able to create their sentences. I could get a good sense of their understanding. It was not difficult to grade. And actually it's a lot more fun to grade that than 2 or 3 different random worksheets, right? Yeah, definitely easier than grading 2 or 3 separate worksheets or handouts, for sure. All right, what about grading more complex assignments? Those were some easy ones that we looked at right there. First of all, make yourself grade in real time as the groups present. So this is an image of the debate project rubric, and the debate project is something that appears towards the end of the 7th grade argument and persuasion unit. But make yourself go through as student groups are presenting and make yourself check these items off. Plus, your students will have this rubric ahead of time, well ahead of time, and you can have them go through and check things off as well. That will make it easier for you to grade too, because if they've gone through and checked it off 9 times out of 10, that's given them a chance to make corrections before it comes to you. Okay, what about ways to take a grade each day leading up to the presentation? Remember this group planning and organization form? What if you were able to take a participation grade each day leading up to it? What if that was where the project grade came from? What if students earned 20 points or 25 points the day of the presentation, which in this case would be Friday? And then what if you gave them points Monday through Thursday so that all those points added up to 100, or whatever point system you use? That way you're just grading them a little bit each day based on observation, based on your conferencing with them, based on interacting with them. So by the time they finish their presentation on that Friday, your grade is done and they've received participation grades the whole way through. So you're not left with a huge project you've got to look over or take home that weekend to grade, because you've been doing it in class in real time the whole way through. In fact, you could even ask your students, how will you earn your points for each day? So once you've passed this out, once you've gone over it together as a class, why not ask them? They might have some pretty insightful ideas for you. Sit down with them for a few minutes as they work. That's a great strategy. You could walk around with these forms on a clipboard that you carry with you in the classroom, and there's one form per group. You sit down with a group where they're working, you talk with them, you ask them questions, you look at what they're doing, you assign a quick grade, you get up, you move on. It might only be a few minutes. That way you're interacting with each group, you're interacting with the kids, and you're recording your observations, aka your grades, as you go. That allows you to answer students' questions. That allows your students to know that you are involved, that you are paying attention, and they see you're taking notes, they see that you're paying attention. Another way is that you could have a teacher table. I don't ever like to use my desk, but a separate teacher table somewhere in a more central location in the room. But you can station yourself at that table. You could call students over to it randomly to check in with them. Especially during group work, don't call one group at a time, because as soon as you call one group, all the other groups know they're off the hook. But if you call one student from this group, one student from that group, they never know what you're up to, they never know what you're doing, and that way you can check in with them and find out how it's going in their groups. Love that random selection there. Okay, so how do I make all of this work so I can teach my students, leave at a good time each day, and actually enjoy my life like a normal person, right? We don't want to spend our time recreating and reinventing things that have already been done for us. Just keep best practices in mind. Create something that you can use and reuse over and over and over. Or take the things that are inside the language arts teacher's lesson plan area and reuse it or spin it or keep it as part of your toolbox, your teacher toolbox that you can go back to again and again. The more choices you can give your students, whether it's technology, whether it's the questions you ask, the more choices you provide for them means the more time that you get use out of it as an assignment. You can grade things as the kids create them. You don't have to wait for them to turn it in to grade everything. Also, take advantage of self-grading rubrics. Give rubrics to your kids and let them encourage them, conference with them to grade themselves before they even turn in the assignment to you. An assignment that is complete and done to the best of your student's ability, it's going to be so much easier for you to grade than an assignment that was not complete or that was never checked over. You can also display assignments, whether it's in the form of a presentation in real time, or whether it's a more traditional assignment that you simply post to the wall. You can display them and grade them a few at a time, and boom, you're done by the end of the week. Okay, I've been there. I know how you feel about these things. It can be overwhelming trying to think about how to put together authentic or alternative forms of assessments. And I know that you just want to do more of what you love. Why can't I just go into the classroom and teach my kids, right? Get rid of that feeling of overwhelm, desperately treading water, struggling to breathe, like you're just staying above the surface. And I know that deep down, I know that using alternative assessments would be pretty amazing, but only if they're easy, if they're doable, if they're realistic for you and your students. So that's what I wanted to show you today, that there are things at your fingertips already, right now, done for you, or things that might just require a little bit of tweaking for you to get a ton of use out of them. One last thought. How can I talk about alternative assessments when administrators ask me, like my end of the year review? Or what if I'm in a job interview? So let's talk about that. During these trainings, I always like to think about how the things that we do on-demand trainings like these are usually hot topics. So if they come up in my year-end review, if they come up with my appraiser or my administrator, or if they're topics that come up in future job interviews, let's make sure we feel really confident in talking about what we're doing in the classroom. So we're going to do the same thing here with alternative assessments. These are questions that come up time and time again, and I have sat with administrators on interview panels multiple times over the years, and I know these questions come up, so I'm going to give you some advice about how to answer them. Let's look at the first one. What kinds of alternative assessments are you using? You might say something like, well, technology is changing so quickly. I'm constantly providing new opportunities for my students to show what they know. So my assessments range from hands-on creative pieces, like the Avid OnePager maybe, to technology-based creations. My students have a lot of choice, right? So as far as what kinds of alternative assessments are you using? Well, I'm using different types of technology. I'm using some more hands-on type activities. And then you could even go through and really emphasize the choice that your students have, as well as some of the examples that we even talked about today. We've done the Avid OnePager, we've done screencastomatic, or we've done Prezi's, or Storyboard that, or we use different online software, or some of my alternative assessments are collaborative, some are more individual. So there's a lot that you can say here should you encounter this type of question. Let's look at another question. How do you use alternative forms of assessments to differentiate? So we didn't really talk a whole lot about differentiation today, but you can definitely see that with all the student choice, with all the options, differentiation is already embedded. So to this question, you could say something like, well, my high expectations mean that all my students get access to the same high-level materials. So the differentiation happens in what we do with the activities. In fact, I could show you an example of what I mean. And so you could pull out an example of some of the student work samples, or examples of some of the assignments you've given, maybe an example of a choice board you've used before. So you should feel confident about talking about the differentiation that's embedded into alternative forms of assessments, right? That's a good feeling. What about this one? So imagine you were asked this question. How do you use authentic assessments to create real-world learning experiences, right? So you could say something like, well, I assess my students in the ways that the world will assess them. So that means I give them opportunities to write, to speak, to build, to create, and to collaborate as they show what they know. Because think about it. All the alternative assessments today that we talked about involve students writing, speaking, building, creating, and collaborating to show what they know. That is the truth, and that's a great response to real-world learning experiences. Okay, so remember this. Nothing I've shared with you today is theory. I've personally used every single one of these strategies all throughout my lesson plans and as a classroom teacher to serve my students where they are, and I did it without creating new things or without taking up personal family time at home. And so all those things that I talked about today, all those different activities, all the technology ideas are embedded in the lesson plans. So as you're going through the units, when you encounter these, now you'll be more aware of what's in there, why it's in there, and how it's a huge advantage for you to be using them and to feel confident that you're giving your kids what they need. which is, of course, authentic alternative assessments. And those activities, those possibilities, those choices exist through all the reading and writing components of our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade lesson plan area. So, super happy to be with you guys today, providing ongoing, realistic support all year long. I'm happy to schedule and create these online meetings, these on-demand ones. Just really happy to share this information with you and help you just have an easier, better, more joyful teaching life and personal life. Okay, I've got a little homework assignment for you. Go ahead and print your lesson plan sheets for the week, or maybe for next week, and look for a couple of things. Either look for an alternative assessment that's already in there that you didn't even quite realize that you had, or just look for an opportunity to quickly change a typical assignment to create a more unique one just by making a few simple changes, especially like on some of those choice board questions that I showed you earlier in this particular training, where all I did was change a few of the specifics and I made them general, and then I was able to use them with anything. Okay, so guess what? You have just earned credit for 1 hour of continuing professional development. This is the link for the certificate for alternative assessment. I know that since this is video playing, you can't literally click on the link, but you could always hit pause. You could go ahead and type it into your browser and get it that way, or I'm also going to leave a link below the video so you can just click on that when you are done. What a great day we've had today together. I thank you for your time, and I really hope that this has helped you get some time back in your life. And I also hope that it's helped you realize, you know what, you have alternative assessments at your fingertips. And so as long as you know what you're looking for, as long as you know what you're using and why you're using it, and seeing the possibilities for alternative assessments, then you're ready to roll. You're ready to go. You've got this. Thank you for spending your time with me today. I can't wait to be with you on our next professional development on-demand training. Have a great day.